Let's move on to Ukraine. This is just, I mean, this is an insane situation. Is that President Zelensky is here in the United States, not just in the United States, in a battleground state, flown there on a U.S. Air Force jet so that him and the governor of Pennsylvania can have a grotesque signing of bombs that are being manufactured to be shipped into war. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Governor Shapiro met President Zelensky on the tarmac. They appeared together. That's Bob Casey, by the way, right there, the senator also from Pennsylvania, who's shaking Zelensky's hands. And they're like gleefully in this factory signing bombs that are being manufactured in Scranton, Pennsylvania, manufactured, by the way, with our tax dollars, and then being shipped abroad to fund the war in Ukraine. And he says, you know, we must all do our part for the fight for freedom, the workers in Scranton, the arsenal of democracy. This is all just World War II nostalgia BS. And the details of it show anything but. I mean, for example, let's put this up there. My friend Dan Caldwell flagged this. You can see right here. Zelensky was flown to Pennsylvania on a U.S. Air Force C-17. The quote, the Biden-Harris administration is using military assets to fly a foreign leader into a battleground state to undermine their political opponents. And if you think he's exaggerating, at the very same time that this was all happening, he literally gave an interview to The New Yorker where he was denouncing any of the Trump-Vance, or I guess Vance in particular, statements saying that the war in Ukraine needs to come to an end. And of course, as always, with Zelensky's visits to America to beg for weapons, there's a split screen as to how the rest of the world is allowed to have like a very rational conversation. In America, just like with Israel, we have to like bow down before Ukraine and be like, no, please take all the money and weapons that we could possibly give you. Put this on the screen. For example, you can't accuse this guy of being a Russian shill. Ukraine, quote, needs to be realistic about its goals. This is from the president of the Czech Republic, President Petr Pavel, a, quote, former NATO general who has been vocal in his support for Ukraine, said Kyiv needed to accept that some territory could remain under Russian control, quote, at least temporarily. He said that Ukraine needs to be realistic. The most probable outcome of the war, he says, will be that the part of Ukrainian territory will be under Russian occupation temporarily, but adds that temporary thing could last for years. And I mean, it's almost noteworthy to me, Krystal, that the most obvious thing in the world to any casual observer is anathema in diplomatic and U.S. foreign policy circles. If you utter that very basic sentiment, you're accused of being a Russian sympathizer. No one is saying that this is a good outcome. It is just the realistic outcome without further escalating the war. And of course, Zelensky's chief aim from everything I've seen so far is to prosecute a case in the media and on the Biden administration at the United Nations to force the United States to allow him to use long-range missiles and strike inside of Russia.
Yeah.
That's what this is all about. This whole little campaign, stop and everything, is about further escalating the war. And, we just talked about Lebanon. How many wars are we supposed to be funding here? At what point does it end? What does America have at stake allowing long-range missiles to be fired inside of Russia, where their president, Vladimir Putin, take him at least somewhat seriously, says that would be an official declaration of war by NATO. Okay, I mean, the guy has nuclear weapons. You have to take it seriously. You don't have to like the guy. You have to take it seriously.
Can we put B1 back up on the screen?
Put it on the screen, please.
I want to dwell on this for a moment. First of all, I have a question for you, Saagar, which is this thing of signing missiles, is this like a long-standing thing? Because there were so many politicians who did this in Israel, which is Jerry Seinfeld did this in Israel, and bombs that were going to like murder, Palestinian children. It is a grotesque practice to be like delightedly signing weapons of war that are going to be used to kill human beings. And I think that this should not be normal. I don't think it should be normalized to the extent it already is. That is deeply disturbing. The other thing, and you mentioned the language about the, quote, arsenal of democracy. This is language that Biden himself unveiled a number of months back. And then he sent out a bunch of, well, to the extent that he does anything or directs anything from his White House at this point, sent out some of his administration officials to circulate a talking point in Congress that providing military aid is, quote unquote, good for American jobs. And this is a part of the story of why we have these, continually expanding military budgets, endlessly expanding military budgets. It's part of the story of why we end up getting ourselves entangled in 1, 2, 3 wars at a time and are never able to extricate ourselves from them, is because, first of all, you have a lot of, people like Josh Shapiro on both sides of the aisle who are do see it as a jobs program and do see it as good for them politically to have these weapons makers in their state and production ramping up to be able to, send bombs to the front line in Ukraine, send bombs to our great democratic allies in Israel, that's obviously said tongue in cheek. And and obviously the people that own those factories and the large weapons makers, they're the ones who really benefit from this. So the fact that this has become such an important component of the American economy and that it has become such an important part of the personal financial bottom lines of so many people who are within a 30-mile radius of where we sit right now, that is an understated part of why we find ourselves in these situations over and over and over again, in spite of the fact that, if you ask the American people, hey, especially with regard to Israel and Palestine getting dragged into a broader Middle East war, the views are more divided with regard to Ukraine. It's roughly, I think, 50-50 split in terms of the approach there. But if you ask about, hey, you want to go fight a war with Israel against Iran? I guarantee you will have majorities across the board that say abso-freaking-lutely not. And yet here we are getting pulled back into the Middle East.
Let me just address that too about Ukraine. I mean, this idea that it injects all this cash flow into the U.S. is bullshit. The top U.S. defense contractors are raking in record profits and are redistributing those profits not to workers through share buybacks to their investors. It's not just the U.S. Ukraine has been the greatest gift in the history of modern history since Iraq to the modern defense industry. They're printing money. And here's the thing, they're not even that good at what they do. That arms factory and all that, we're spending more to manufacture arms than we did in the 1990s for something per capita basis, which is way more expensive. They're not even good at their jobs. That's the ironic part of all of this. It's not particularly that great for the U.S. economy. It's only good for a bunch of defense contract shareholders and investors. Now, let's continue on this whole, what are we doing here exactly? Shall we? Let's see. Let's put this on the screen. Financial Times. Russia overwhelms Ukrainian forces on the Eastern Front. Quote, Moscow is taking advantage of Kyiv's redeployment into the Kursk region. Remember when Ukraine invaded Russia and everyone was like, wow, what a genius move. Well, their own commanders are now saying, quote, commanders and soldiers see this as the cost of the Kursk offensive and a poor trade-off. Kursk was a good idea. It exposed Russia as being weaker than many people believed. But we are paying the price of it with more of our own land. And in fact, they talk about how Russian forces have captured several towns in the Donetsk region. It says Ukraine, quote, had hoped its audacious operation would force the Kremlin to redeploy resources from Donetsk, but that has not happened. And instead, they have had several towns now fall to Russian forces. Russia is now facing calls inwardly, actually, to increase the amount of soldiers and for conscription purposes. They have no signs. Their economy is a full-on war economy now at this point. I mean, they have no current signs of turning back. Every single thing that the Ukrainians have done to try and escalate has been good for headlines, but the actual ground situation has changed nothing. They've not gained any more territory, especially of their own territory. They allegedly, is so sacred and that we're supposed to bend over backwards to keep for them. At every level, it's not working. Even their long-range missile strikes and all that. It's like, well, okay, they can't even make a case. How many square miles of territory are you going to get back if that were allowed to happen? And is that worth the risk? No, because when you start talking this way, they can't do it. The whole argument falls apart. And instead, Zelensky is in the pages of the New Yorker going after our presidential candidates on U.S. soil, interesting, and also basically saying that it's a ridiculous proposition that they could give up a single ounce of territory. This is when, a sizable portion of his own population wants to just end the war.
Yeah.
The ones who are left, not the ones who are, filthy rich and fled, who are all over Central Europe, but that's a whole other situation.
And, I largely don't blame Zelensky, but in one way, I think he is very culpable for the current situation, which is that he has painted I would say overly rosy is sort of too kind. He's just lied about how the war has been going with his own population. And so even in spite of that overwhelming propaganda campaign, not unusual in wartime, but in spite of that propaganda campaign, you have increasing numbers who are saying, listen, guys, we're going to have to give up some of our territory. And if you can imagine that if you had a leader who was more honest about the trade-offs and what a realistic path forward looked like, then you might have an even greater consensus within Ukrainian society in favor of, all right, at some point we have to get to the negotiating table, we have to make some sort of a deal. My point for a long time has just been this, like, tell me what the end game is. Tell me what your plan is. Tell me how this ends. Tell me how it ends well for Ukraine. Tell me how it ends well for us. Like, how much, is there a dollar figure on it? Is there a timeline on it? Is there a plan? Is there a strategy? And effectively, since that, was it the spring offensive that, was hyped up and ultimately, didn't result in the massive gains that were predicted or hoped for or expected or whatever. That was the last time that there was any sort of U.S. strategy with regard to this conflict that was at all comprehensible to me. And at this point, they're just on autopilot. They just want to, keep the sort of rhetoric, the, human rights rhetoric, which is obviously incredibly hypocritical when you see what we're funding in Israel and Palestine. They just want to keep that flowing and kind of keep it on the back burner, keep it out of the front, out of the headlines in the news so that we can muddle through. And they're locked into kind of indefinite war mode, like low burner, indefinite war mode. And it's disgusting because, again, you're talking about actual human beings who are being slaughtered. You're talking about real cities that had, vibrant lives and communities and history to them that are being flattened and, will never be the same again. And, but, there's no ability to have a serious conversation about trade-offs, about what the plan is, about what the strategy is. And so you just end up in this muddle. With regard to the politics of this, it's pretty split, 50-50 who people think would do a better job. And I think it's pretty split in general, 50-50 in how people want to approach the Ukraine war. I can put this up on the screen. After the last debate, this was polling that came out that showed which candidate would be better on the issue. 49% say Trump would do a better job with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war. 47% say Kamala Harris. So pretty split. I also think we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that this is a primary issue that people are voting on at this point. Not to say that there's no one that cares about it, and it's certainly not to say that it's not important. But oftentimes foreign affairs doesn't end up being the top issue that people are voting on, especially when you don't have direct American boots on the ground. But nevertheless, regardless of where the political standing is, the Biden-Harris administration owes the American people an explanation. And Trump, by the way, owes the American people an explanation of, because he just uses this, it never would have happened with me.
He says he'll
I'll end the war. Yeah. But, specifics are important here. What does that mean exactly? And because Kamala has subjected herself to basically no adversarial interviews. Trump has done very few adversarial interviews. We only had this one debate. This is the sort of thing that neither one of them has really truly been pressed on.
And this is, a good show at the top because I know everybody wants about inflation and all that. The truth is the president and their ability to influence inflation, macroeconomic events, and in general, that's really going to touch your economic life. It's pretty low. But in war, they have total discretion to be able to do whatever they want. The imperial American president has 100% ability to get the United States into a full-on nuclear war. Not enough people ever really grapple with that. Only when tensions are very high or 2004, after the Iraq War. Prior to that, in the Soviet Union times, it was more elevated because people had the specter of nuclear annihilation on their minds at all time. But that's mostly gone away. But if you look at the most consequential acts in the last 25 years, all of them come back to terrible foreign policy mishaps. The war in Iraq ended up costing $6 trillion. The war in Afghanistan cost $2 trillion, tens of thousands of dead. The downstream effects of that on global trade, on U.S. position, on American superpower status, on Chinese competition, all of it is a disaster. If you look right now at Lebanon and that situation, also Russia and Ukraine, the consequences of each of these individual decisions are going to be tenfold to whatever tax legislation that you pass in the immediate term. And the problem is the tail end effect of it is just so high, and people don't really think that way. They think very, they have a lot of recency bias, and most people are not paying attention, and that's fine. It really is. But you just shouldn't be surprised then when something flares up and then your son ends up having to get deployed, or you end up paying more for a gallon of gas, or your favorite company or whatever can't ship you anything because the straits are completely closed from warfare. And that's a very likely possibility. And in both of these cases, we're looking at a very, very unstable world, of which we are the primary bankroller of both. And that's what I think just underscores it really for me. These wars, we have nothing really at stake, for real. Like, what does America care? What do you care if you live in whatever, Scranton, Pennsylvania, the square mile territory control of the Donetsk region of Ukraine? Same with Israel and with Lebanon. Why should we be funding this? Nobody will give you a real straight answer. Always like, oh, democracy.
American Jobs Program, Saagar.
Yeah, but that's fake. It's like a couple hundred jobs in Scranton.
It's also, like, I mean, it's also deeply sick to just like structure such a large part of your economy, around weapons of war meant to destroy human beings.
Right.
But even if there is, some truth to like, oh, this is creating jobs in Scranton, Pennsylvania, or whatever, it's a deeply, deeply sick and depraved way to structure and think about your economy. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is the whole thing just seems so listless, so directionless.
Yeah.
Like the American super is just being buffeted around by world events and, doing whatever Zelensky wants us to do, doing whatever Bibi Netanyahu wants to do. And with Netanyahu and Biden, like, this guy is a political adversary. You know what he's all about. And yet you still can't bring yourself to, break from the mass, overwhelming bipartisan consensus that we just got to do whatever Israel wants us to do in perpetuity, no matter the consequences to our own strategic interests and no matter certainly the consequences to human life in the region. So very dark developments, dark developments on both fronts.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.